And for the last 10-20 minutes or so, we've been watching British forces streaming across that border into Iraq. We understand there are still substantial coalition forces in Kuwait preparing to head into Iraq. And the news on the push to the north, the objective, of course, Baghdad, is that troops are now within 200 miles of Baghdad. According to some reports, they've taken the town of Nasiriyah, which is an important staging post on the Tigris and Euphrates valleys.
Now, those are pictures now from Baghdad. And we were talking earlier on to Paul Woods, our correspondent there, who was explaining that those black plumes of smoke, which everybody initially thought were the results of explosions earlier this afternoon that were heard in the city, are in fact plumes of smoke from oil pools, which are believed to have been set on fire by the Iraqis. Paul Woods was explaining that it was some sort of means of confusing the Americans when they were making these attacks on the city, but that apparently is what this smoke is coming from. We've
known for a while that they had been filling ditches with oil, but it was thought that they would only set them on fire when troops actually approached the city. The idea of deflecting missile and bomb attacks would seem to be a bit naive today, because all of the targeting is done technologically and not through the human eye.
Now, the other thing we've been hearing about as well, of course, are casualties following last night's very heavy bombardment of Baghdad. The Iraqis say today that 3 people have been killed and more than 200 have been injured.
A few minutes ago, we heard from General Tommy Franks, who's leading the coalition forces, and his estimate of what was happening in Baghdad. He said the regime was confused. It's not as it appears on Baghdad TV, he said, but he didn't know anything about the whereabouts of Saddam Hussein.
And black smoke, at least what appear to be maybe one well. I don't know if that's another well or just part of an oil facility or an oil pipeline that is burning in the distance, but that is part of the backdrop as this convoy continues now to make its way west. This highway we are on, I can't really name, but just to give you an idea, we are not the only convoy that has been on this road. It has been nearly continuous. The number of vehicles from every type of military weapon you could think of traveling down this highway, all headed in the same direction. Not just U.S. Marines, but also Army units, and also a large number of British forces, as this just continues to be a building force driving up from northern Kuwait, heading into southern Iraq, and now repositioning itself to move farther into the country and eventually move on to Baghdad. These are the AAVs that are used by the Marines. They're amphibious assault vehicles. It's essentially their armored vehicle. You may think it rather unusual that an amphibious machine is roving around in the desert terrain of Iraq, but it's an all-purpose machine, and right now they are beginning to push farther and farther away from any shoreline. It is believed that when this mission is all said and done for the U.S. Marines, it will be the farthest that they have ever gone away from a beachhead, and that includes most recently last year with Afghanistan. So we drive forward with them, heading west, and heading to, right now, an objective that is unknown. Jim?
One person here was that they very quickly changed outfits when they saw that the Marines had arrived. The other thing we can now report is that this port is fully secure. That's according to Colonel WALDHAUSER of the MEU. He said that it took them a little bit longer than they expected it to, but now they've accomplished their first task here. Jim?
Jason, have you had any chance to talk to any of the civilians in Qasr to find out from them their impressions of the arrival of Allied forces, their prospects, what they think about the future?
Jim, unfortunately, no chance to talk to any of them. They're in the town and here in the port, we're embedded with the Marines. We're at the Marine side, not really free to go off on our own, but we have heard reports that from some Marines as they were coming in that they felt they were being waved to by some of the civilians in the neighboring town. Although they've also been encountering problems, small arms fire, they say, from the town of Qasr, and so they haven't been able to. They are trying not to go into the town. That's not part of their mission. They really don't want to go in there and do street fighting in the town of Qasr. Their plan here is to secure this port and try to get humanitarian aid flowing in as quickly as possible. Jim?
Jason, just update us. What is that's burning behind you?
This was a boat that was in dry dock here in the port, and earlier today it was taken out by mortar fire. Most of the port is left fully intact, and that was their plan. They did not want to destroy structures here, but this boat was located very close to this Coast Guard building, one of the buildings they were very concerned about. They were concerned that they might encounter resistance there, that they might encounter Iraqi army troops there, but it turns out they did not. Jim?
In fact, near the Kurdish city of Barbarash, about 20 kilometers northeast of Mosul, Iraqi troops with automatic rifles and heavy machine guns patrolled the ridge about 400 meters, where our cameraman Chris Matlock shot this footage from Kurdish-controlled territory just beyond that line of control. Some of them paused at midday prayers to say their prayers, bowing towards Mecca. So those lines still being held near Mosul, and halfway down from here, about 40 kilometers from here at the Turkish border, all quiet, although some Turkish troops do appear to have entered. Jim?
Jane, all quiet. It's almost too quiet. People seem very, very relaxed considering what's been going on in Baghdad. Is that an indication of what they expected, or perhaps they don't know what's going on?
They do know what's going on, but they're a little bit insulated from it. For one thing, most of the people have actually left the cities. This is a huge city behind me, Dohuk, one of the biggest and most prosperous cities in northern Iraq, but it's deserted, as are most cities. People have just fled to the countryside, to the villages, to wait it out, thinking that they'll be safer there. As for military officials, despite all the talk about how Kurdish militia will fight Turkish forces if they enter and defend their territory, nobody really wants to inflame the situation. It's in the Kurdish interest to say that Turkish forces haven't entered. In fact, in Ankara today, Turkish Defense Ministry sources are saying they haven't entered either. The fact is that they are continuing to come in the way they seem to have over the last few years, in small numbers without heavy arms, but making clear that they are maintaining a presence but being a little bit low-key about it. Jim?
They are keyed to both early warning and the linkage from those early warning radars to their command and control centers in Baghdad. This suggests that over these last 4 or 5 days, the coalition has been very effective in knocking out, in using anti-radiation missiles, for example, some of those early warning radars, and also disrupting communications between those radars and the Iraqi military in Baghdad. Secondly, I took from General Franks that this whole notion of surprise and flexibility was weighing very heavily here. Witness the attacks during the day, the attacks during the odd, unusual hours. This is one of the points in trying to disrupt the Iraqi military and continue to work the surprise campaign 24 hours a day. The other remark I'd make too, Jim, is Special Operations Forces. He made a very, very heavy point early on in stressing that this campaign began with special ops on the ground, really the opposite, special ops ground then air, the opposite of what happened during 91.
So we've already made the ultimate sacrifice. Because of the courage and the dedication of these heroes, the mission of Operation Iraqi Freedom will be achieved.
Jim, the other point that comes through from listening to Tommy Franks is this very important point about the ground campaign. One of his briefers, Brigadier General Vince Brooks, I thought made a very, very telling comment, and that was that to this point, the incursion into Iraq had reached further depths than any of the ground incursions during Desert Storm, which may suggest, just based upon that particular data point, that the cavalry may be much further north towards Baghdad than the reporting to this point has suggested. I think a very, very important development, Jim.
As I listened there to General Franks, and he was talking about his fallen soldiers, the soldiers of the Allies, I thought it was important to note, too, the way that he stressed Iraqi civilians, not outright, not saying it, but in the strategy, when he said he wasn't going to provoke a firefight in an urban area, civilian area, needlessly. They are going to bypass every major town, aren't they?
Yes, indeed. Of course, the critical issue here will be Baghdad itself, but I think we have seen to this point the campaign, particularly in the south, the units there trying to get around Basra to engage the enemy forces there as much as possible, but not into the city. And certainly, Jim, the same with the element of the 3rd Division that's proceeding up the Euphrates. They very much want to avoid engaging forces in those cities as well that are crucial to the crossing spots. The crucial issue, however, will be Baghdad itself, and that's whether the coalition can induce surrender from the Iraqi forces and thereby prevent an actual urban assault, which would be most worrisome to commanders.
You know, as we're watching some of that video there, we had a soldier with a shoulder-fired a light anti-tank weapon that he was using to take out an Iraqi armored personnel carrier. One thing that I find curious, Iraq's military, and there will have to be an Iraqi military in the future, it would need some of this hardware, wouldn't it? Why not take it off, put it in a holding area someplace, and put it under guard? Why should it all be destroyed in place?
I don't believe it is, Jim. I think what you're seeing there are coalition forces using, for example, anti-tank weapons against those Iraqi units that are resisting. But the rules that have been laid down, the leaflets and all, in fact, have stressed that for Iraqi formations that want to surrender, leave your equipment behind, collect that, put your tank weapons in a particular angle and azimuth, and depart. Separate yourselves from that equipment, because you're exactly right. Long term, for those Iraqi units that we can rely on for the stabilization period of Iraq, we'd like to have some modest set of equipment there that remains.
Apart, piece by piece, with grenades or explosives. Once started, the tank's own ammunition would do the rest. Another tow missile fired on a suspected Iraqi position, while shoulder-fired rockets were used to speed the demolition process. The Marines are a quick fighting force. They needed to be on the move once more. Men raced to get out of the way of the destruction of their own handiwork. Automatic grenade launchers fired, adding to the chorus. The village will remain under suspicion. Not everyone apparently happy to see the arrival of U.S. troops. But Iraq's weapons of war are depleted somewhat. The Marines of Charlie Company know that there is more work ahead, and with it, the risk of more danger. Martin Savage, CNN, near Basra,
Gas. The alert had been sounded, and it was feared that from elsewhere we were under attack. Thankfully, the panic was short-lived. Late afternoon, the 7th Armored Brigade, the Desert Rats, crossed over, and we joined them, using a makeshift bridge erected by the army. We passed burnt-out cars and the clothes left behind by Iraqi soldiers who'd either fled the battlefield or surrendered. American Marines were dug in all around, scouring the desert landscape for yet more signs of danger. And yet, the most telling signs, one of 2 Iraqi flags still fluttering in the breeze, this one at a deserted lookout post. This, until a few hours ago, was an Iraqi frontline stronghold. Nothing much to see, just a couple of porter cabins where the Iraqi flag still... And the Americans are in control of this part of the country, and the Iraqis have been pushed back, if they've not surrendered, towards north of the country. Terry Lloyd, ITV News, inside Iraq.
The American Army general leading the coalition forces, the war is on course to oust Saddam Hussein. With every hour that passes, Allied troops appear to be gaining more and more ground, especially in southern Iraq. A massive deployment of troops has already helped secure one of the ports of Qasr. It's reported there are still pockets of resistance in the town, though. This is Iraq's only gateway for supplies brought in by sea, now virtually under control of the Allied forces. Yet again, Iraqis, some apparently injured, are giving themselves up to British and US soldiers. Huge convoys of military vehicles are also embarked on a major logistics operation, carrying heavy-duty engineering supplies as well as crucial defence systems. Thousands of British troops in the form of the Desert Rats have joined US forces in taking control of Iraqi military bases, including in and around the city of Basra. Many of these were targeted with devastating effect last night by the US Navy. While fighter jets from the USS Constellation went on bombing raids, Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired at both Baghdad and Basra, successfully paving the way for troops to capture the country's second city this afternoon. No doubt a major boost to the morale of coalition forces, which are reporting that Iraqi soldiers have surrendered in large numbers rather than put up a fight.
Any comment on that?
At a news conference this afternoon, General Tommy Franks said this would be a campaign like no other in history.
A campaign characterized by shock, by surprise, by flexibility, by the employment of precise munitions on a scale never before seen, and by the application of overwhelming force.
General Franks insisted the war was about liberation, not occupation. Video released by the US military shows the latest precision bombing, which has destroyed a wide range of military targets on land and at sea, helping in the fall of another city, Nasiriyah, northwest of Basra. And after the environmental disaster of the first Gulf War, there's much relief that they also appear to have control of at least one major oil field, and that only 9 of the hundreds of oil wells are burning after being sabotaged. Bit by bit, though, the ground assault on Iraq is pushing towards the capital, Baghdad. Still, nobody seems to know where Saddam Hussein is hiding, nor has there been any confirmation about his weapons of mass destruction. John McIntyre, BBC News.
A helicopter flight over the port of Qasr reveals the area is relatively quiet. And down below, British soldiers do some war tourism, looking at one of those giant billboards of Saddam Hussein. Taking Qasr was a joint operation. The 15th US Marine Expeditionary Unit was under the command of the British Royal Marines Commando Brigade. Now, US Marines rest at the port after more than a day on the move. Some, like 21-year-old Corporal Jeremy Archer, had feared the worst.
I expected a big war, I guess, but they're all giving up, so it was easier than I thought.
Not all are giving up, though. About 3 kilometers away from the main port, there are pockets of resistance. The commander of the US Marine unit sent up Cobra helicopters and fired artillery to destroy the Iraqi fire.
They did resist, but once it appeared that they would have to deal with some overwhelming firepower, they would have a tendency then to give up.
The British commander says the resistance is isolated.
It hasn't been a particularly cohesive fighting force. It's been a D-30 gun firing a few rounds prior to its destruction, or a group of individuals firing.
It took longer than expected to secure Qasr, and the military says it's still mopping up small pockets of resistance in the town. Nonetheless, the military says it plans to bring in the first elements of humanitarian aid, perhaps within 48 hours. Qasr is Iraq's main commercial port. It lies at the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, which flows into the Persian Gulf. This was an important strategic target for Allied forces and will be the main port of entry for relief and other humanitarian goods. Just yesterday, Iraqi ministers vowed that Qasr would never fall, but hundreds of soldiers have given themselves up, and now they are POWs under US and British control. Christiana Manpour, CNN, at the port of Qasr in southern Iraq.
Battalion 7th Marines on the move once more. We're riding with them. This is our vehicle in conjunction with a convoy heading west now, leaving Basra behind us and the main oil field objective that they captured yesterday. But speaking of oil, take a look out the window here as we travel along. There, the brilliant orange plume. It seems to be a key indicator of an oil well that was set alight. There are said to be about 9 oil wells burning in this part of southern Iraq, nowhere near as bad as the projections some had made about the scorched earth policy of Saddam Hussein. And now take a look forward. This is the convoy, mostly made up of Marines of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. That vehicle right there, an AAV, an amphibious assault vehicle. This convoy is heading off west to a new objective. So far, we haven't been told what that is, but eventually the goal is going to be all the way to Baghdad. For the Marines here, these amphibious vehicles work just as well in the desert as they do in water, and they're doing just fine on the highway, a highway that is shared with a lot of military might, all moving up from northern Kuwait and farther into Iraq.
7th Cavalry is still sitting on a roadside in south-central Iraq. They have not moved as far down this road, or as far north, actually, as they would like to have moved. There are a number of reasons for that. Other developments on the battlefield. There's more than just one arrow on the general's maps, more than the arrow for the 7th Cavalry. There are many arrows folding, bending, and moving about. But perhaps the main reason why the cavalry had to park on the side of the road today, much to its own chagrin, was that it encountered up ahead a larger Iraqi military force than it had anticipated. The cavalry was planning to, again, continue its march northward, but the Iraqis put up a surprisingly substantial defense. They showed great pluck, and they did not disperse, even when they came under heavy artillery fire. It was at first unclear how many Iraqis were in the path of the 7th Cavalry. What happened, however, was that the Army sent out an artillery barrage that did not totally destroy it. The Army then sent out the Kiowa helicopters. The Kiowa helicopters had a bit of a dodgy flight because the Iraqis who survived had anti-aircraft weapons, heavy machine guns, and shoulder-fired missiles. And they took aim on the U.S. Army's Kiowa helicopters. Those Kiowas survived by some slick maneuvering. At that point, it became even more important to disperse that Iraqi unit which lay ahead of the 7th Cavalry. So the Air Force was called in with a number of A-10 Warthogs. They have big Gatling guns in the front. They plowed through the Iraqi lines over there. It's not clear if all those Iraqis were wiped out at that point, but we know that more than 180 Iraqis were standing in the path of the cavalry, and they showed considerable pluck and courage before most of them were knocked out of business. That being the case, however, it's getting fairly close to dark here, and further progression up the road at this hour of the night seemed imprudent, and that decision went all the way up to the Corps commander and the divisional commander. So the cavalry did not make as many miles, did not cover as many miles today as it wished it had. Walter Rogers, CNN, with the 3rd Squadron of the U.S. 7th Cavalry in central Iraq.
At first light, the concrete edifices of power were still smouldering. The presidency, a modern copy of the great ancient ziggurat of Ur, stood blackened against the skyline. But last night, it looked and sounded like this. A massive attack on the presidency and surrounding buildings. A geyser of fire erupted from the office of the Deputy Prime Minister. It seemed as if the entire government quarter was exploding in flames and debris. Iraqi anti-aircraft fire ripped through the night as cruise missiles and bombs targeted the symbols and infrastructure of the regime. This morning we passed the president's newest palace. The portico wrecked, struck by a missile, but his bronze images intact. It's not west of Baghdad, which officials said had been hit last night. No one, however, was hurt. The documents scattered in the explosion were all related to tourism, lists of employees slated for promotion, accounts, memos. This is the first time we've been allowed to come to a building that's been hit. The officials say it was a tourism complex, a restaurant. It is, however, rather close to military facilities along the river, beyond the bank behind me. And just adjoining, another palatial government building. The complex does appear to have been targeted, hit by 3 missiles. The government's continued denial that the Americans and British have taken prisoners or territory came in the form of a communique read by an unnamed colonel.
أعلن الصهيوني الخبيث رامسفيلد خاسئا عن أسر فرقة عراقية.
The Zionist Rumsfeld has put on the false cloak of victory. He said they had taken hundreds of prisoners in Fall, forgetting or ignoring the determination of the people of Iraq to fight in the path of God and for the sake of their homeland.
They won't respond to American assertions that President Saddam Hussein may be injured.
Could you tell us whether you have seen the President personally yourself in the last 2 days?
Next.
How he is?
Next. Please ask something reasonable.
I was just trying to find out if you'd seen him.
Yeah.
For the soldiers, there's no question that President Saddam Hussein is still their leader, as they rest in the daytime and prepare for another long night in the shell scrapes at the side of the road. As dusk falls, we can see dark plumes of smoke on the horizon. It seems that the Iraqis have set fire to oil in trenches, an attempt to defuse the laser beams and make the job of the targeters much more difficult tonight. Lindsay Hilsum, Channel 4 News, Baghdad.
Well, let me tell you about a major strategic change tonight. Because the Americans haven't got Turkish permission to come in and augment their forces in the north, they've announced that they're sending the 4th Division, up to 40,000 men from the United States, to join the already large, up to 250,000 soldiers that is, front, which has opened up in the south of Iraq. And it was to southern Iraq, as you say, I went today to the strategically important town of Qasr. Qasr, Iraq's only deep water port, and therefore a vital objective for the invading forces. British and US defense secretaries say this town fell more than 24 hours ago. That simply isn't true. We were airdropped into a small corner of the port and told it wasn't safe to move far from here. Not only is the town still not secured, Iraqi forces are still fighting in parts of the port's southern end.
The resistance is quite variable. I mean, you have military units, you have civilians, you have virtually everybody in civilian clothes. At times, military units start to change in civilian clothes, and they move and claim they're not in the military, but when you find their position that they just came from, there's military IDs, military uniforms, military equipment, weapons, mortars, what have you, which makes it kind of difficult.
He hopes to have all of the port area secured by tonight. The town could take even longer. US Marines under British command had to fight their way in here from early on Thursday morning. And so did the second wave coming in from this morning.
We crossed the breach about 7:45 this morning. Right after we crossed the breach, we had contact. It's basically an abandoned police post, something like that. They had dug in troops there, and we had contact right away with them. Ended up calling in mortars on them and then artillery. Got a little close to us, so we ended up pulling back a little bit.
It wasn't fun. Got a little hairy, especially going through the breach. Got some sporadic small arms and small millimeter mortar fire.
It's certainly more ferocious than the first Gulf War, but for GW2, it appears that that they may have some desire to fight, but very quickly they realize what a powerful war machine we have, and they surrender almost right away.
Some 450 Iraqis had been taken prisoner here. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, we were allowed to film them from a respectful distance. Several were clearly injured. How many had died, we can only guess at. We do know, though, that one US Marine was killed during the assault on Qasr. Well, this is what it's all about. The deep water port, the container port of Qasr, which is so vital to Iraq. It's the only one they have. And these are the people behind me who secured it. An unusual operation, US Marines under British command. The port area where I'm standing now totally secure. But no triumphalism here, the Stars and Stripes staying firmly under wraps. The border with Kuwait so close you can see the dock cranes from it. And here a vast convoy of military and commandeered civilian vehicles waiting to begin renovating the port. But it's that more Iraqis are surrendering, but it's not quite on the same scale as the surrenders seen during the 1991 air bombardment. It is in this area, the Rumaila oil field, that some wells have been sabotaged as Iraqi troops retreat to Basra and beyond. But the invading forces are also approaching Iraq's second city tonight.
A multiple rocket launcher in action 7 miles outside Nasiriyah, opening up a bridgehead across the Euphrates for the push to Baghdad. Nasiriyah now captured, say the Americans, but if that's so, it's not been without resistance. 4 reconnaissance scouts reported dead after an ambush in central Iraq. The race now on to kill the enemy before it kills you.
They were shooting at our ground forces, so we fired to suppress and destroy their artillery and their rocket fires before they can shoot back at our troops.
Overnight, US Marines used howitzers to blast a path across the desert. And by this afternoon, British and American Marines were surrounding Iraq's second city, Basra. Over 1,000 prisoners now taken inside Iraq, but an eyewitness some 15 miles from Basra claimed the Iraqis were still not giving up.
Certainly there's been a lot of evidence of fighting throughout the day. This morning there was a large number of very loud explosions and the sound of artillery fire echoing out across the landscape here. There's been tank battles, from what we've been told by US Marine commanders in the area. Who actually controls Basra, though, it remains difficult to tell.
Outside the city, abandoned Iraqi tanks set alight by US Marines or used as target practice. Within the last hour, 3 Marines reported injured in combat outside Basra, with hundreds of Iraqis taken prisoner.
The oil fields were spared destruction. The good news is only 9 of the roughly 500 oil wells that are in the Rumaila oil field, only 9 were sabotaged.
US Central Command certainly relieved that very few southern oil wells have been set alight, although